Now this is a brownie, a beautiful brownie. Now he's going to go. I don't know if he knows he's going to get it. There he goes, there he goes. That's more like it, and he's off. And you should always play the fish on the reel, otherwise you've got line dangling around your feet. And we've got to be careful here, we've got some weeds, so I'm just throwing a little bit of side strain, left-hand side strain, turning the fish out, and you can see the fish swimming out to the middle of the lake now, away from the close bank. I don't want to get him into the bank, well caught in the weeds if we can. Don't mess any fishing in return. Wet your hand, grab the leader, put the rod down, no sudden movements. Turned away, and I think the reason is the leader is still floating. Must have seen that leader and just turned. Oh, there he is. Having said that, he came back. Away from that weaver. Oh, that's it. That's more like it. He's like he's off at last. He's decided he's hooked. Now, if we can keep his head up, there he is. Head out the water, just draw him in, and Bob's your uncle. Now that's the success of the dry fly. Well, we're here today at Blakewell Fishery, one of the premier still waters in the country. It's North Devon, located in Barnstable. And this is a beginner's guide to still water fishing techniques. And as a result of that, you've got to know some of the very basics of fly fishing, and the most important basic is what the tackle looks like. Quite simply, you have many items of tackle. You have a reel and a rod, obviously, fly line, which comes in various densities, and we'll talk about fly line and the types of fly line later on. You have backing, and again I'll talk about backing in a moment, but I'd just like you to see what type of materials we come across. And you have a selection of flies to catch fish, and that is the most important thing, the choice of fly according to what the fish are like. What we're going to start off this video with is how to set up your tackle outfit. The video is going to concentrate on basic guide for beginners taking up still water fishing, which includes fishing tactics, how to play fish, how to return fish, how to set up your tackle, and where to fish in a lake, where you're actually going to find fish in a lake when you arrive at a new water. We're not going to dwell too long on casting. Casting is something which you need to go to a professional to learn the casting and techniques. Video cannot really teach you casting techniques, so this video is structured purely and simply to learn fishing techniques and how to improve your catches on still waters. Right, let's have a look at how you put the tackle together. Here we have a fly reel. This is the Daiwa Altmore fly reel, top quality fly reel this, and I'm just going to show you how to put the backing, which is the very first thing you should put on your reel, onto the reel. Now, there's many types of backing in the fishing world, and perhaps one of the best ones is called braided monofill. Braided monofill is made of individual strands of monofill braided together to create a hollow but thick, strong rope. Now, for something I'm going to show you later on, and the reason I would like to dwell on later, is before you actually start putting the backing on, cut off about 2 foot of this braid and put that aside. And you'll see why later on. And this is before you even put the backing on, cut the braid off. Now, there's one or two very, very important tips with putting backing to the reel. And the first thing I think you should know is that to prevent the reel and line slipping, you should tie in the very end of your braid an ordinary overhand knot. Just one of those. Pull it fairly tight and lock it. Snip off the stub, and what I'm actually going to do is tie a slip knot around the actual reel itself, and the granny knot in the end of the monofill stops the slip knot sliding. So you poke the line around the reel, and just a very simple knot where you just twist the line around the main stem like this and tuck the short end back through once and twice and pull tight. And what you're left with, if you've done it correctly, I'll just slide this knot to the end like that. The granny knot locks against the knot, and you just slide this down and it should tighten nicely around the reel. And I think the biggest tip here, certainly for beginners taking this up and putting the first backing onto the reel, This won't work, so I'll just show you why. If you just start to wind this in, see, all that happens is that the backing will slide around the reel and not wind itself in. And many, many times I've come across people, anglers who fish for 10 years, 5 years, or beginners who haven't attached the backing in the right way. And what will happen is the line slides around like that, even when you've got the entire backing and fly line on. So really essential tip, when you attach the backing to the reel with a knot, I put a small drop of super glue. Leave that dry for a second. And the super glue will set and stop the backing spinning around the reel. So when you wind the line on, it's going to get a firm grip, it's going to attach itself to the reel. You're not going to be worried later on about the entire line slipping within itself. We leave that to dry. Got to wind the backing onto the reel now, and it's very important that you connect the backing to a form of spool holder like this. This is what we call a green dragon. Doesn't matter if you use a green dragon or you can use a biro pen and put the biro between your knees and wind it on like that. This is very useful for me. I put a lot of backing onto the reels, so I buy a green dragon. And the green dragon goes onto the very end of the rod, and then I put the reel on the bottom end of the rod to wind it in. And again, if you haven't got a green dragon, don't worry about it. You put a biro between your knees and the backing goes on the biro between your knees, and you just wind it similar to what I'm doing now, but the difference is the backing is on the reel. You wind this backing very steadily, and it's very important that as you wind the backing in, you do two things. First of all, you keep the line tight between your left index and middle finger, and this is if you're right-hand wind, and that keeps a bit of tension between the reel and the fingers, so the backing doesn't go on slack. And secondly, I don't think you can get a good shot of that, but I wind the backing back and forth across this reel, covering from one side to the other. And what that does is lays the backing on a nice, even, smooth build-up, and I'm not going to build up a great lump in the middle, which is going to cause problems later on. And in this case, I've got 80 yards of backing, and really we put on the entire spool of backing. If the reel's big enough to hold 80 yards, put the entire spool of backing on. And then attach the fly line. The fly line is the most important part of your tackle kit. It has a weight, and the fly line weight corresponds in some way to the actual rod you're going to use. To give you an example, fly line's weight can be between number 1 and about a number 15. 1 is a very light fly line, and 15 is a very, very heavy fly line. And there's advantages and disadvantages with both. A heavy fly line is going to be easy to cast because it's got a lot of weight, but, and here's the biggest problem with heavy fly lines, is the heavy fly line will land on the water with a great big splash and spook the fish. So I tend to recommend using lighter fly lines. And for trout fishing, we're really talking 1 to 9 as the range. Most still water fishermen in this country are using perhaps 7s and 8s. I prefer myself, this is a double taper 5 line, and I'll tell you about double tapers in a minute, but it's got a number 5 on it, which indicates that it's a 5 weight fly line. And that's a good line weight. It's not too heavy to scare fish, and it's not too light to make casting difficult. Once the backing's on, we have to put on the fly line. And when you buy your fly line, it comes in a plastic packet like this, plastic container. There's a sticky label inside. Take that out, put it aside. Tells you what your line is, so later on, once you've put the fly line on and you go fishing for 6 or 8 months and you're not too sure what fly line you've got, the sticky label should be on your reel showing you what it is. You then cut off your little black tags. Careful not to cut the fly line when you do that. And find one end of the line and pull it out. Put the spool together and just twist it to lock it. That's this type of fly line. This is a Cortland fly line, and Cortland work on this plastic principle. Other companies have other things. You've now got to attach the two together. And this is a fairly simple process. There's one or two ways. One of them is using glue. The preferred way I prefer, is to use sleeves. These are plastic sleeves of assorted sizes. And what you do is snip open the packet and find a sleeve that is of suitable size. And you can see there's different colour sleeves in here. It doesn't really matter what colour. They're all different size. Get one out. And there are different sizes because you get different thicknesses of fly line. The heavier your fly line is, the thicker it's going to be. So when you get a sleeve, test the sleeve size first by inserting the fly line into the sleeve and giving it a little bit of a shake, and if it drops off like that, the sleeve is too big, and that sleeve is designed for a fatter fly line. So we try another sleeve. That's a tighter fit, so that one could be it. Put that on, put the fly line. Oh, no, that dropped straight off. So again, that's too wide a sleeve. And you keep going until you find the right size sleeve for the fly line. That's more like it. Now that one didn't fall off, so we've got the right size sleeve there. It doesn't want to be really tight. It wants to be just fairly friction, a little bit of friction there, but loose enough so that the line will slide in and out, and tight enough so it doesn't fly off when you give it a wiggle. Having found the sleeve, snip off about ½ inch and put the sleeve onto the braided backing. Okay, it's just like threading a needle. Careful how you do it, and pop the sleeve straight over the braided backing you've got here. And slide the sleeve right out the way. At the moment, it's got nothing to do with what we're going to do here. Come back to the fly line, pick up the fly line, and remember I was saying earlier on that the braid is hollow. So what you want to do is insert the fly line up the middle of the braid. Okay, it's a little bit slow to start with, and what happens is the braid will start to fray. Don't worry, keep going, just pushing the fly line, working the fly line down the braid, and you'll find at one stage it will just start to bite. There you are, it's bitten. And this is rather like threading pajama elastic around your pajamas, where you just work the fly line down the braid until you've covered about 1.5 inches. About 1.5 inches of fly line is going to be sufficient grip on this. Slow old process. It's what we call slugging. It's just a little bit of feeding the backing up the fly line until, as I say, there's perhaps 1.5 inches there. About that much. In its own right, this is a very, very strong grip. You don't have to worry about it. See, the harder I pull this, the harder it grips, because it works on a principle like a Chinese sort of finger torture principle, where you put on a sleeve. The tighter you pull, the thinner it contracts and the tighter it grips. So it won't come off like that. But because it's a braided material, it can quite easily fray undone. And that's the purpose of this sleeve. You slide the sleeve up onto the fly line and just work the fly line down the sleeve until the sleeve is right up to the tips of the fray. And once it gets to the tips of the fray, that's far enough. It should be a tight fit. You don't want the sleeve to fly off on one cast. And this is why we tested the sleeve to start off with. Too tight a fit and you wouldn't be able to get it on. So I'm just going to hook my nails in here, give it a little bit of a pull. That's tight. I've just taken it to the fray. When you get to the fray, get rid of these little stubs. Just snip off the frayed bits. And then finally you're going to slide the sleeve that tiny 1/16 of an inch just to cover the ends, so they're totally covered, like that. We've got the fly line down the middle of the braid, plastic sleeve slid up to the frayed ends, stops the thing fraying. Very good, firm, solid attachment. Have to wind it on. Take a biro, something like that, slip it on the spool of the line, and again your knees are the easiest. You won't be able to see this, but the knees are the easiest. I just put the biro between my knees, and just like I was doing with the backing, wind the fly line on, again weaving the fly line back to and fro across the line until the reel is entirely full of fly line. The fly line's only 30 yards long. On average, the fly line's 30 yards long. Most fly lines are 30 yards long. Some of them are a bit longer, but I think as beginners, you're looking at a standard fly line, something like that, and a 30-yard fly line is going to be ideal. So you wind on the entire fly line, and if you've judged the amount of backing correctly, it should finish, and the entire fly line will be on with about 1/8 of an inch to spare, gap between the fly line on the reel and the top of the reel. Well, that's a good full reel. I've got enough of a gap underneath the frame here. I've got enough of a gap so the line is not going to rub on the reel and scrape off the entire skin, and yet it's full enough so that when a fish takes the line, I'm not winding in very tight, small coils of fly line. I'm winding up good, big coils of fly line. That's your basic kit setup. We come on to this piece of braid I mentioned earlier on. Bring this back into the picture. This 2-foot length you chopped off your backing before you put it on the reel. Somehow you have got to have an intermediate bit between your fly line and what's called the leader, and the leader is your front piece of line that you attach your hook to. And the simplest connector between the two is a thing called a butt, B-U-T-T, butt. And you have to put these two together. But first, make your butt. Very easy. Take a needle. Large eye, long needle, perhaps 2 inches long, quite a thick eye. And the butt is made by, first of all, threading the braid through the eye of the needle. Hence the need for a large-eyed needle. And I pull through about 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, something like that. Then lay the needle along the braid, insert the needle very carefully into the middle of the braid, being hollow. It'll go in, and feed the braid up the needle steadily. What you don't want is the braid to burst while the needle pops out the side, so just very carefully feed the braid up the needle until the entire needle is covered. Careful to leave a 1/2 inch stub. You pull the braid down till the needle bursts itself through, and then holding the bare needle, feed the braid up towards the eye of the needle, just pushing the braid up the eye of the needle. You then have to twizzle and roll the braid, and this is the tricky bit, until the needle disappears within the braid itself, and you start to get a loop, and this is what you're actually going to finish up with, a loop. Keep feeding the braid off the needle eye, and again insert something like the end of a biro or anything into this loop, because you don't want to lose the loop. The loop is what we're actually making. And keeping the biro in the loop, I just work the needle out and off, and the needle has nothing to do with it anymore. Put that aside. Bring back the loop you've made and just brush out any slack you get into the line. Just a smooth brush like that. Take out the biro bit, and you see what I've got in the front end of my braid is a small tight loop, and it's that we're trying to make. This is the butt. It's a little bit small, so you enlarge the loop just by unpulling just 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch at a time until the loop is about the size of a small piece of sweet corn. And that is the braided loop you've made. You have to once again come back to this magical stuff, this super glue, and squirt a single drip of super glue just about 1/4 of an inch from the V of the loop, just about there. Just a drip, and the super glue will set and it will hold the loop, and the loop will neither be able to get larger or smaller. It will be fixed at that size. Cut the fly line, this backing stuff, and what you need to do is find the double bit. There's a double bit here where the braid has gone down itself to about here, and this is what we call the double bit. You come down about 2.5 to 3 inches from there along the single and snip the thing you've just made off. And there's a bit more braid here to make some spare butts. And that is the final result. This is what you're actually trying to make, a short piece of line with a loop in one end and about 3 inches of hollow braid on the other end. You've got to attach it to the fly line now. pick up the sleeve, and this is the same process as you did with the backing to the fly line. The sleeve is cut to about 1/2 inch long. It's the same size. I've tested it on my fly line to make sure it's the same size. And once again, insert the braid into the sleeve. So the sleeve is now mounted onto the braid. Slide the sleeve up the braid, up onto the double bit, and exactly as before, insert the fly line into the braid, and as before, work the fly line down the backing until it reaches the double bit, the stoppage point. I'll just get it going, there we go, and then back to this slugging, working it down. It's very important at this stage that you make sure that the fly line is worked all the way down the braid and till it meets the double end, the thick end here where the braid is formed to make the loop. If you don't go that far, you'll get a very limp hinge in effect, and when you're trying to cast the thing, it won't turn over. So just work away, just working this thing down. Exactly the same as we did earlier, the difference being you have a definite stopping point, which I'll show you in a moment, and the stopping point is there. It can't go any further down because the double bit of braid will stop it. So I've reached the final stage of that, and as before, grab your sleeve and slide the sleeve up the fly line. Again, just use your nails if you can, up to the frayed ends, nice tight fit, and snip off all these frayed ends. And then the final stage with this is again to slide that sleeve up just to cover the stubs. And this butt is going to stay on your fly line now for as long a period as you like, perhaps 2 or 3 years. You don't need to do this more than once every 2 or 3 years. It's stuck on there, it's going to stay on there, and it's from this stage onwards that you will change your leader daily. The last thing not to forget about setting up your terminal tackle, your base tackle, is to put on a sticky label just so you know what the line is in future years. And to do that, you have to take the spool apart. So you'll see there's a little silver catch on this fly reel. It's a very simple matter of sliding the catch across, holding the catch across, and lifting the spool out of the reel. And the sticky label I'm just going to put just somewhere around here, stuck to the actual spool itself. The sticky label should come with a fly line, and what you do is peel the sticky label that tells you all about the fly line onto the reel, so in future use you know exactly what you've got. Just a little press there, and this tells me it's a Cortland fly line, what the model number is, which is an HT. It's a number 5 line, or in this case it's a number 4 line, double taper, and it's a floating. And I'll talk a bit more about fly lines later on in the video, but this is how to set up your basic tackle assembly. We put that together, and whilst on the subject of reels and showing you how to take apart the reel, I'd like you just to see 1 or 2 of the features of a fly reel that you need to be aware of. Obviously there's a handle, which is how you wind the reel in. On some reels you have a drag system at the back, and this little button here you twist, and there's a positive and a minus, or positive and a negative on this reel. And if you twist it towards negative, what that means is that when you pull the line off the reel will spin very, very easily. It doesn't take any effort to pull the reel and the line off. If I turn it towards positive, you can see that a lot more force is needed to work that reel. And the reason for that is when you're playing fish, you try and set the drag system according to the size of fish you're going to be catching or hoping to be catching. If you're catching 3-4 pound trout on fairly heavy leaders, you can set the drag as tight as that last one, but then perhaps conditions change and you go down to 1 or 2 pound leaders, very, very fine fishing conditions, and a drag of that type will just snap every time you hook a fish. Later on I'll show you how to play fish. You put them on the reel, you play the fish by hand, but wind them in on the reel, so the reel must be free enough to spin according to the strength of your leader. And that's set, as I said, it's fairly tight setting. It's always going to be easy to wind in. Reels have got a very good drag system. It's always easy for the angler to wind in, and it should be more difficult for the fish to pull the line out. Reels attach to the rod very simply, and if we just take the reel off, you'll see how easy it is to attach to the rod. There's a little collar in the cork handle which the reel slides underneath, and the bottom of the reel just is pushed over like that and screwed up to lock the nut onto the reel. Very simple, easy fitting. Now, rods vary immensely in the fly fishing world. You get different lengths of rods, different actions of rods, different materials of rods, different manufacturers of rods. For the still water angler, I'd suggest you want something between about 9 foot and 10 foot, maybe 10 foot 6, but that's very, very long. 9 foot to 10 foot is the ideal length of rod. Carbon preferably, because it's a lightweight but very controllable material. And the choice of rod really down to your budget. Fly rods start at perhaps, a good fly rod would start about £40, £50, right up to £1,000. I mean, you could pay the earth for a fly rod. My favourite rods are the Daiwa Amorphous Professional Fly, which is what this one is, and one I'll be using a bit later on in the film, which is an Outmore, a 9 foot 6 Outmore rod. They're both 9.5 foot long. They're both rated to take certain weights of lines, and the rating is literally a set of numbers on the rod that tell you what line you should fish on it. This one says 7 to 9, so Daiwa suggests that you put a 7 to 9 line on this rod. Now, that's not bad advice for beginners, but as you progress and get better and better, you actually want to avoid fishing 7 and 9 lines on a rod. And the simple reason for that, without getting too technical, is that when a rod is rated, it's rated to take a 10-yard length of its heaviest line. In other words, this one is rated 7 to 9, so its heaviest line is a 9. 10 yards of 9 will balance this rod beautifully. 12 yards of line will overbalance it. The rod becomes a bit sluggish and slow. And so you go down to a little bit lighter line, maybe an 8 or maybe a 7. And the better the caster you are, the more line length you're going to have out, and therefore the lighter the line you want to use to avoid overloading it. As we saw, I put a number 4 line onto this reel. The 4 line goes onto a 7 rod and will balance it perfectly for my type of fishing. Whilst on the subject of fly lines, let's have a look at a little bit more about fly lines, colours and densities. Fly lines differ in numbers of ways. We've already mentioned the weight of a fly line. Now we have the density, and the density of the fly line is whether the line floats or sinks. Whether it sinks quickly or slowly depends on its density. For example, this orange one I've just put on, it's a floating line. Bright colour indicates a floating line, as is this yellow one, another floating fly line. Called floating because it floats. Intermediate line, the next one. Slightly subtler colour. Again, difficult to determine because it's a light blue. Some people will think that the intermediate line is a floating line, but the intermediate is not. It's a very slow sinking line, hence the name intermediate. Neither floater nor sinker, and it has its fishing uses. I'll tell you about that later. A medium sinker, generally brown in colour, indicates that it's a little bit darker than the intermediate, so it sinks a bit quicker. You have fast sinkers, and then the fastest of fast sinking lines, this one, the high D line, the super fast sinking line. And a line like this will sink at about 7 inches per second. I mean, that is a very, very fast sinking line, and only really useful for the armoury of the reservoir angler, the angler who goes out to water that's 30, 40, 50, 60 foot deep, and the fish go right down. You're going to need a line that sinks that fast when the fish are deep. Most of the pleasurable fishing is with floating lines because the fish feed off the surface. The action's on the surface, you're going to see everything happening. So I tend to fish floating line perhaps 85 to 90% of the time. On the front of your fly line comes perhaps the most important part of your tackle, the leader. There's many, many ways of looking at leaders, many types of leaders, and I've just got 3 of the most important and basic ones here. First of all, we have a braided leader. Braided leader is made of the same material as your backing. This one is a sinking braided leader. Like fly lines, you have different densities of leader, and it's sinking. It's black, that tells you it's sinking. It's impregnated with a tungsten paste, which makes it sink. On the thick end of the leader, there's a big loop, and what you do is you loop this leader onto the fly line onto the loop that you made, and on the front of the fly line you finish off with a short piece of monofill. I'm not going to put this one on you, I'll show you about that perhaps later on, but let's look at the most used leader. This is essential for beginners to help themselves on the casting, to help turnover, to help presentation, that you buy yourself, and these are the key words here: knotless taper. Leaders, roughly speaking, want to be about 9 foot long. Manufacturers now do the entire work for you. They make knotless tapered leaders, 9 foot long, tells you at the bottom here it's 9 foot long, and it says 3.4 pound, which indicates that the very tip of it, the thin end, is 3.4 pound. That's the breaking strain of this leader. I'll come back to this one in a minute and I'll show you how to attach that to your fly line and show you the very last type of leader, a piece of monofill, various types of monofill. This is Daiwa's Super Shinobi, very strong, very supple, thin monofill. And again, it's got a breaking strain. In this case, this breaking strain is 3 pounds. That tells you that it'll hold at 3 pound weight. And again, you get various strengths of 3 pound, 5 pound, 10 pound, 15 pound. You can make your leaders out of this, preferably by tapering them by joining, say, 3 pound to 6 pound to 9 pound to 12 pound. That's your best design of leader, just stepping your leaders together. But to save all the hassle of knots and the breakdown of leaders designed through knots, far, far better is to attach one of these made knotless tapered leaders. Take it out of the pack. There's a right way and a wrong way to undo the leader. The right way, keep your thumb and index finger into the loop of leaders you've found here, and have a look at try and find an end. There's two ends, there's a thick end and a thin end. And if I just pull this one out a second, you'll see that this end is very, very thick indeed. It's about, I'd guess, 20, 25 pound of breaking strain of monofill, a very, very thick end. And you slowly unravel the leader. It's twisted around itself perhaps 6 or 7 times until you've got rid of the twists in it. And then keeping it on finger and thumb, just unwind. You see it's springing off there, keeping the tension on it, and it gets thinner and thinner until the very front of the leader is almost impossible to see. It's 3.4 pound, very, very thin monofill, and that is why it's a knotless taper. If I just draw it through my fingers, you'll see the leader gets thicker very steadily, thicker, until you get to the real thick back end of the leader. There's no knots in it, and the beauty of this type of leader is it's very, very easy to cast and turn over, so it avoids tangles. To attach the leader to the fly line, very, very simple. You tie what we call a double overhand loop knot. And what I'm doing is finding about 8 inches of leader at the thick end, that's the important end, folding it in half, pulling tight, and then you just twist and form what I call a granny knot. Others have different names, but just form a granny knot like that. But hence the name double overhand loop. You just tuck the loop through a second time. Okay, pull tight very steadily, and one of the most important tips of pulling any knot tight in monofill is you should lick the monofill when you tighten. So give that a good moistening and pull tight. And the reason for the lick is that monofill is prone to burning through friction, and the burning through friction will weaken the monofill and make it snap. So you lick it to avoid the friction burning the monofill. Cut off the stub of this loop. Nice and flush, you don't want to get any ends to create tangles, and then it's a simple matter of looping the 2 loops together. The loop which I showed you earlier on the butt, which I've put on the fly line, and the loop of the leader you've just tied. There's a very easy way to remember this, and I like to think of ABBA, the singing group, and the simplest way to remember this is to remember ABBA. You have 2 loops, one is A and one is B. And A is the loop that is attached to the fly line, A for attached, B is the bit. And quite simply, ABBA is spelled A-B, B-A, so you take A into B, and then you take the end of B, wherever the end of your leader is, and poke it into A. And then just pull through the leader until the knot forms that, like a reef knot effect. That's a good, strong, very simple join. And the beauty of this, other than any other form of jointed leader, is that when I want to change the leader, I quite simply push the two together and I'll pull out the old leader to thread in a new leader as and when I want a new leader. Let's have a look at the types of flies that fly fishermen may use in their fishing day. I have here my selection of still water flies. You have river flies, lake flies, they differ in some way or other. And there's many types of flies, and really you do need to be aware of some of them. For example, some rivers and some lakes tell you that the rules are a technique called nymphing. Now for that you have to fish nothing but nymphs. As a result of that, you need to know what a nymph looks like. We have spiders, nymphs, buzzers, shrimps, snails, lures, traditional wets. These are all minefields and names of dozens of different types of flies. It doesn't really matter what you fish, but let me just point out the basic types of fly to start with. Spiders, which is this little chap here. Buzzers, which are over here. And nymphs. And these three flies together represent actual insects. These are what we call deceivers. They deceive the trout into thinking that they are real items of food. Other than the deceivers, there's attractors and lures. And attractors don't look actually like insects or food. Attractors we have over here, and again these have various classifications. This is what's called a traditional wet fly, determined by a very fixed solid wing, all these flies along this entire row have got solid fixed wings, and they are traditional wet flies. We have palmered wet flies, and the term palmer is indicative of a fly that has hackles and feathers running the entire length of the hook rather than just at the head. And these are palmered wet flies and traditional wets. The final type of fly to have a look at is the lure. The lure has nothing to do with fish's feeding instinct. Here we have a violent, vivid selection of lures. These are all mini lures. Lures can be from huge to small, and these are called mini lures. They're generally fairly small, but the indicative pattern of lures are lots of brightness, lots of fluff. They don't look like real insects or bugs at all. We have some things called whiskey flies here and cat's whiskers here, baby dolls, very provocative fishing names some of these have got. I think they catch anglers more than they catch fish. But as I say, these are mini lures. The traditional pattern of a lure is big and designed to annoy the fish in such a way that the fish has a real slash, a real attack at the fly, rather than fished in a manner where the food, where the fly is actually taken as a lump of food, so not a slow retrieve. So with lures, you tend to try and fish those in an aggressive, attacking manner, and fish will really hit a lure hard. They catch fish when other techniques don't work, and as we'll see later on in the video, lure fishing really does catch fish fairly easily, and really I would suggest that you stick to lures when fishing is perhaps difficult and you haven't got ideal fishing conditions to catch fish. Now, the last little bit about lure fishing, let me just dig out a large lure, just so you can see the type of lure that traditional lures are. And they go up to really large flies. I'll dig one out of my pocket. Here we have the types of lures that you'll really come across. Here we have a traditional lure size. Floating fry, this one's called a floating fry, the white one, and a good name for the orange fly is a whiskey fly. And you can see how big they are, and this, and even bigger, twice the size of this you get lures, and general lures are this kind of size. The mini lures I showed you are, for me, most of my pleasure fishing, most of my enjoyable fishing is in competitions, and in competitions you are limited to a maximum of a size 10 hook. Now these are a lot bigger than a size 10, these are more like 8s and 6s, and they're long shank, and they're too long for competition fishing. So most of my flies will fall within the competition rules, but I thought I'd dig these large lures out to show you what they look like. The last type of fly to look at, my favourite type of fishing of all, is the dry fly. Here we have a selection of dry flies. What makes a dry fly? Well, quite simply a dry fly. It's called a dry fly because it floats on top of the water. Wet flies sink, dry flies float. For the dry fly to float, it's got to be fairly fluffy and bushy, and let me just take out a dry fly very briefly here, and you can see the wind doesn't blow it away. The dry fly of its own accord sits up on the table, and just hold its tail a minute, will sit on the water like that. It will float up on the water, and quite simply, if fish are rising on the surface of the water, they are feeding on flies just like this on the surface, and that's the time to fish a dry fly. Having talked about the flies, you need to know how to tie on a fly, and I've just come on to a really thick, large salmon iron like this to show you how to tie on the fly, make it a bit easier, being more obvious. The knot is called the two-turn turl, and the most important thing is obviously that you thread the fly on like this. You thread the hook, and with this knot, actually push the hook right out the way. It's got nothing to do with the knot itself. And you come back to the end, and the first thing you do is tie a single overhand knot, what I go back to calling a granny knot again, just a knot like that. Close to the end, fairly small loop. The knot is called a two-turn turl, and that is because you go through twice. Excuse me, there it is. So the short end has gone through twice. You then take this long loop of monofill here, roll it around your finger to make a second loop, and put the second loop through the first loop. But look very carefully. If you undo the turn like that, if I poke this in that direction, I'm going to lose one of those two turns I've put in. So your second loop you put into the first loop in a manner that creates an extra turn, i.e. in that direction. Having poked your second loop in, grab hold of the second loop, grab hold of the short stub, and just pull the two apart so the knot tightens. As before, when tying this knot in monofill, you want to give it a good lick to lubricate it, but for the time being, I'll just pull that tight, cut off the end, and with this knot it's quite useful because you can cut the end off now before the fly gets too near it, and that way you're not going to snip the feathers of the hook and deplete the hook. Bring it back and jam the knot into the eye of the fly like that. Untwist the loop, thread the loop over the back side of the fly. Very important you go over the back side of the fly, hold the fly and pull the long end, and as you can see, because it's a slip knot, it just starts to tighten itself around the hook. That is called the two-turn turl, and it is by a long, long way the safest, strongest, and perhaps most important of all, it is the only knot that guarantees your fly fish is true and correct through the water. The tucked half blood, which most anglers unfortunately use, will let you down, and there are many, many times when you won't catch fish because of the knot. With a turl knot, you guarantee success, at least in the way your fly fishes. Let's have a look at a typical lake and why we would choose to fish an area of the lake. There's one or two things that really are important, and I think the most important thing is safety, and this is why I'm looking into the lake in front of me here, because the wind is on my left rather than me standing on the other side of the lake and looking. The wind will be on your right, and if you're a right-handed caster, the wind on your right is very, very dangerous. That's probably your most important safety tip, along with always wearing some form of eye protection whilst casting. In terms of fish, you're looking at the water to try and find rising fish. You're looking at the water to find where the wind is blowing, where the food will be collecting, where the food will be blowing from, off trees and things. And we can see here a little bit of ripple. There's various bits of calm in the water, there's bits of ripple in the water, and they both have advantages and disadvantages when fishing. The ripple is blowing food along, and the calm is attracting and catching food and holding food. There's one or two fish rising on the surface, and this is a good indication of the type of fly we're fishing. For example, fish feeding on the surface is a very good indication of either fishing a dry fly or a nymph or a buzzer or some natural imitation in the surface film. And really my final decision of where to fish would be down to promontories and points sticking out from the middle of the lake and giving an angler an advantage because you're sticking out. And there's a point across to the left, there's a point I can see, and there's a point opposite me on the lake. There's one or two points, and certainly when I arrive at the lake, and if it's a new lake, one I've never fished before, a point is one of the first things to look for, and especially if there's fish rising around it. And the point at the end of the lake up there has got fish rising and is the ideal place to start. Now I'm going to start fishing over there, but I'd just like to run through some of the very, very basics of casting first. It's not a casting video, so it's not very instructive about casting, but I'd just like to show you one or two of the most important things about casting first. And casting is very, very simple. You've got to really realise that you're trying to cast the fly out to the fish, and the most common cast for stillwater anglers is called the overhead cast. And quite simply, the overhead cast is where you hold the line in your left hand, the rod in your right hand, assuming you're right-handed, and you cast the line back and forward in the air, working out line. As you can see, the line is shooting out of my left hand whilst I'm casting, just lengthening the line until I've got the length out that I require to fish with. The reason I'm showing you this here rather than the point, I don't want to muck up my point where the fish are rising with basic casting techniques. Just to recap with casting, it's a fairly simple movement. The right arm is travelling in fairly long movements back and forward, and the biggest tip I can give any beginner is never to cast with a broken wrist. And a broken wrist is this, where the arm is not moving and the wrist is cocking and opening like that. That loses control of the cast, and unfortunately it's the way most beginners begin. Far easier to control the wrist, keep the wrist tight, and use a longer arm back and forward as the casting momentum. And again, a couple of very brief tips on this casting technique. Firstly, try and stop your back cast with the rod tip very near the vertical every time. A high back cast and a lower forward cast gives you a good clearance on the back cast of trees behind you, and when you lay your final cast down on the water, it'll turn over and land gently on the water and not fall in a great big wriggle. And the last little tip about casting is there is a timing pause. As you can see, between the back cast and the forward cast, I wait for the line to straighten out and unroll before commencing the forward stroke. And it's that pause that makes the casting technique so effortless and so easy. And lay it down. As I say, this isn't really a casting video. It's not designed to teach you about casting. It's just to show you the basics of casting, the very brief basics of casting. The purpose of this video is to give you more and more understanding of lake fishing techniques. So let me wind this in, and without further ado, I'll wander up to the point and show you just how to fish a lake. Right, well, here's the point I was talking about. Let's set up here and give it a go. This looks like a good spot, plenty of fish rising. One or two tips for beginners, for everyone in fact. When you put your carbon rod together, line up the rod rings, that's fairly obvious, but most important of all, tape together the two halves of the rod, and that can stop your rod wearing too much, the male and female ferrule wearing down, by just putting it gently together. A little bit of sticky tape, and this is just ordinary electrical insulating tape. Tape the ferrules together, and it takes about 2 seconds, but it can save your rod. I'm going to start off with a floating line. We talked about lines earlier on and different types of lines. In a situation like this, you can't really not fish a floating line. The fish are rising everywhere, the sun's behind the cloud, there's a little bit of breeze, it's warm and muggy, and the conditions are dictating that floating line is the ideal choice today. And probably start off with a nymph, because there are fish moving on the surface and they should come up to the nymph quite nicely. There's a little tip or two again which always makes life easy for fishermen, and here's my floating line. And one of the tips, again, threading up the rod, can be easy or can be difficult. I think the easiest way, here's the leader I looped on earlier, the easiest way to think about threading up the rod is to thread, that's caught, the fly line rather than the end of your leader. So strip off a few yards of fly line, come back to the end and thread the fly line itself through the rod rings. It's a lot easier to thread the fly line through the rod rings than the thin monofill. The thin monofill will blow away and it's difficult for you to see. So thread the fly line up the rod. And then you choose a fly. And choice of fly is literally down to the individual to start off with. If you're not catching fish after your first fly, perhaps you try a change. Use a little bit of common sense. The fish are rising. I could try a dry fly to start with. I could try a nymph. I could try a midge pupa, an imitation, anything that imitates natural food, because the fish are rising in great numbers. I'm a great fan of nymphing myself, so I'm going to start with a nymph. And I think we'll start with one called a dieback, a Welsh pattern. Using that turtle knot I showed earlier on, tie the nymph on. And again, having tied on the fly, you do need to do one or two things. It's not just a question of starting off. You need to do one or two things. And the first and most important thing with any form of wet fly, any form of fly that sinks below the surface, I would suggest lick your fingers and wet the fly. And what that'll do is make the fly sink straight away. If you start off with a dry, feathered wet fly, it will actually start floating. You don't want that. Then do make your leader sink. Absolutely imperative in all forms of floating line fishing that your leader sinks. There's one or two compounds for that, and my favourite is something called permasink, very simple stuff. And all you do is you apply this to the cast to make the leader sink. Wet the leader first, smear on the permasink, and then wash the sink off the leader, set that up. And finally, as a nymph fisher, the thing about nymphing is the takes are generally very, very subtle indeed. So I always suggest, and always fish myself, one of these things. These are called strike indicators. Little bright, in this case orange, some pink, some green, sticky back foam really. And all you do is you fold this indicator around on itself and stick it onto the leader roughly where the loop is before you start fishing, and that makes it a lot easier to detect the take. And just before I start, there's a couple of little tips which I'd like you to know about in fishing, a couple of important points. And the first thing is etiquette. You're fishing, whether it's a public water authority reservoir or a private lake like this, you're fishing somebody else's property, so do respect it. Pick up your litter, don't leave your litter on the ground, don't let your dogs run around and be a nuisance. Pick up any pieces of monofill, and invariably if you look round you're going to find old pieces of monofill like this left around. And the worst thing, and it really gets me annoyed, is when people throw pieces of monofill on the ground and discard them for wildlife to get caught up in. The easiest way to dispose of monofill, wind it around your fingers and just snip it once, twice. And what that does is just cuts it into about 2.5, 3 inch lengths, and then you put that in your bag to take home. As an angler and a respective angler, you should really, as I said, look after people's property. But one of the other very, very important issues is to try and join the Salmon and Trout Association. They're the governing body of our sport. They look after the sport, and the money you put into their association help you in the fishing in the long run. They lobby Parliament. It absolutely does everything for fishermen, and really I strongly recommend you join the Salmon and Trout Association. I think we should go and catch a fish. We'll give this nymph a go and just see how nymphing goes, and perhaps a little bit later on take you through dry fly fishing, take you through lure fishing, fishing floating lines and sinking lines. But first of all, let's wander over here and try and catch a fish. Right, this is where we're going to give it a go, in this corner. The fly, when you've set up and tied it onto your leader, is hooked into the keeper ring here. This little tiny ring right by the cork handle is called the keeper ring. That's where your fly is hooked on. When you arrive at the lake, just at your little spot like this, just have a quick look around, see where the fish are rising. Remember, if you see a fish rising, it's a feeding fish. It's going to take your fly if you present it in the correct way. But how do you start? Well, having got the fly in the keeper ring, absolute golden rule, really, just to make things very simple for you, before you take the fly out of the keeper, strip off 8 or 10 pulls of line off the reel, and then pull the line down so that you get about a rod length of fly line outside the rod before you attempt your cast. Otherwise there's not going to be enough fly line weight to cast. Then I drop that, unhook the keeper ring, unhook the twist, and just pop the fly into the water down by your feet. Just roll it in and drop it into the water. And you then strip off a few yards of line, what you think you're going to be casting, and start to work the line out. As I showed you earlier on, or perhaps hopefully you've had professional tuition which has learnt you the correct method. Lay it down and then ready to go. And with nymphing, the key to nymphing is detecting these very, very subtle takes. And concentration is everything. The reason you put on that orange strike indicator is for you to look at the indicator whilst it's coming through the water for any hint of movement. As soon as you see it move,